I'm going to start with a general introduction, and then my wife is going to try to fill us in on the background stories and the theme that we had of courageous women and holy chutzpah with both Tamar and Ruth. And then I will take the last part with many very, very deep and profound teachings that have to do with the book of Ruth and the story of Tamar. So I just wanted to start with something relatively simple, but it will give us the context, is why exactly do we read the book of Ruth on Shavuot? And so I'm going to run through many different answers. Anytime you ask a question like this, there is no one or two answers. There are many perspectives. So this is in no particular order. But the last word of the book of Ruth is David. And it's brought down, Shmuel Navi wrote the book of Ruth. It says in the Gemara in Baba Batra that Shmuel Navi was the one who wrote the book of Ruth. And it says, why did he write it? In order to establish the lineage of David HaMelech. Remember, it was Shmuel who anointed David to be the future king. And according to tradition, next week is Yom Yerushalayim. And according to tradition, it was Shmuel and David who established for all time where the Temple Mount is. It's a whole discussion in the Gemara, but it doesn't say explicitly in the Torah exactly where the temple would be built. And it was Shmuel and David together that through learning traditions and doing some archaeology and tiolim, they were able to establish exactly where the Temple Mount is. So obviously, Shmuel Navi is very connected to David HaMelech, and this is one of the main reasons that he wrote the book. But it's more than that. According to tradition, David HaMelech is born and dies on Shavuot. So it's not just because of the book of Ruth that we have a connection to David. According to tradition, he was born and died on Shavuot. We said that that's a sign of a real tzaddik who is born and dies in the same day.
Like Moshe Rabbeinu.
Moshe Rabbeinu is a good example. Zayin Adar. Later.
And our youngest grandson was born on that day. Zayin Adar.
Zayin Adar, yes. Zayin Adar. What was I going to say next?
About the location of the Beit Mikdash and reading it on Shavuos.
Okay, we'll just continue here. One of the allusions to the book of Ruth and why we would read it on Shavuos is the gematria of Ruth equals 606. And so it's brought down, she as a Gioret, she took on 606 new mitzvah because all of humanity at that point was given the mitzvah, the 7 mitzvah b'nei Noach, the 7 universal mitzvot of the children of Noach. So it's brought down that she took on 606 more mitzvot. Another thing of the name of Ruth is that the Torah portion that we read on Shavuos is Yitro. We read the giving of the 10 Commandments in Parshat Yitro. If you look at the name Yitro, it's actually the name Ruth and a Yud in front. Ruth and not in the same order, but it's the same letters. And so that's another reason that it's brought, is because Yitro and Ruth are brought as the archetypal converts, that we give great merit that we named the parsha where the giving of the 10 commandments is to Yitro, to give honor to not just to converts, but the underlying understanding that ultimately the Torah is meant for the whole world. We accepted it first, but it's meant for the whole world. And an additional is that there is this idea that when we came to Sinai, in a sense, we all converted, because even though we had a concept of Bnei Yisrael, and there was a concept of conversion already, but technically we didn't have the mitzvot. And so that is why that there's a tradition before we came out of Egypt. So in order to eat the Korban Pesach, all the men had to be circumcised. And this is one of the things that has to happen in a halachic conversion, is there has to be circumcision. And even if there was a circumcision done for reasons other than conversion, then they take what's called a tipat dam. You have to take just a little prick of blood, and that is sufficient to be counted as a brit milah. And it says 3 days before we received the Torah, men and women, married men and women, separated from each other. And there's a tradition that everyone went to the mikvah during those 3 days, which is the second part of conversion. So it's not just root, there is this idea that it's as if we all converted to be ready to receive the Torah. Another connection between Ruth and David is it said that the root, pardon the cross-lingual reference here, but the root of Ruth is Rivaya. This is brought in the Gemara, like in the 23rd Psalm. Kosi Rivaya, my cup overflows. So they said that from Ruth comes David, and Rivaya also means saturated, that he saturated Hashem with his songs and praises. And in the Tehillim, David says, Ani avdecha ben amatecha. I am your servant, the son of your handmaiden. Who is the handmaiden? Ruth. In other words, he always looked back on Ruth as being his like spiritual source. Two other reasons here, three other reasons, is that the story of Ruth happens during the wheat harvest. The whole story, from the time they go back to Beit Lechem, and she starts going out to the fields and she meets Boaz. So then, but it's all happening around the wheat harvest. When is the wheat harvest in Israel? Shavuos time. Ad hayom hazeh, to this day, wheat is harvested around Shavuos. And that's why the special offering in the temple on Shavuos is 2 loaves of wheat from the new harvest. Well, it's called a mincha chadasha, a new offering. This is coming from the new wheat harvest. So the whole story of Ruth plays itself out right at this time of the year. Another reason is the incredible chesed that Ruth showed her mother-in-law, Naomi. She, in a sense, gave up everything. She could have stayed in Moab. She could have returned to a kind of like a kingly family. And instead, she decided to go penniless with Naomi, who at that point, she had no obligation to. And as we know from the story, Naomi tried to discourage her from coming. She would not be deterred, and it was all coming from her chesed. So it says in the Gemara, it says the whole Torah is chesed. from the beginning to the end. And so Ruth represents that. One other one is, it says in the Gemara, there are three things that are acquired through suffering. Torah. Now, it doesn't mean that the suffering is necessarily negative. It just means you have to have Mesirat Nefesh. You have to struggle for Torah, Eretz Yisrael, and Olam Haba. Thank you. And Olam Haba. All three of them, you're not handed them on a silver platter. And we certainly know that about Eretz Yisrael. And to master the Torah takes a lifetime. It's not suffering in necessarily a negative way, but you really have to dedicate yourself, and you really have to sometimes sacrifice quite a bit for these three things. And so Ruth and Naomi, there's a lot of suffering going on in the story. And so we're told that it's also one of the reasons, because here we're receiving the Torah. And we have to know that the Torah is not easily acquired. It has to be an enormous amount of dedication, sacrifice, and it's sometimes suffering. And we certainly could connect it to recent events where our being here is not always pain-free, put it that way. Okay, so that is our introduction to Ruth and Shavuos.
Okay, so another name that's connected to, that shares the same two letters. Now, in Kabbalah, we talk about there being a gateway into a word. And, when you learn Diktuk in Ulpan, you learn about the Shoresh. But in Kabbalah, we learn about the Sha'ar. The Sha'ar are the two most important letters within the root. So the root of Ruth, that was a good one, it shares two letters with Tamar, the Taf and the Resh. The addition in Tamar is the Mem. The Mem is like the 40 days that Moshe Rabbeinu spent on Har Sinai, the 40 years wandering in the Midbar, the 40 sa'ah, the measurement of a kosher mikvah. All of the number 40 has a lot of significance for us. So those two shared letters with Torah, Yitro, Tamar, and Ruth, they all share the Sha'ar, which is the top and the Resh. So when I was studying the Midrash about Tamar, I have this project I call Midrash Racha. And when I'm studying, I get a vision of what the scene might look like. So I envisioned Tamar. The story of Tamar is that someone asked on the Zoom about the background of Tamar what was the holy chutzpah involved with her problem? She had a problem in that she married the sons of Yehuda, one after the other, both died. And she was left as hanging. She was supposed to be given to the third son who needed to grow up. And he came of age, but Yehuda was holding back and not giving her to this Shelah, the third child. So she took matters in her own hand. And I'm just going to walk around and show you this. A little tiny sketch. Okay, I'll pass it around. Mm-hmm. It's a sketch. But see, I have my notes here on the back side. I'm going to just walk around with it. The sketch of Tamar sitting with Petach Einayim, in the opening of the eyes. All you can see on her are her eyes. It's like us behind our corona masks. It's like all you can see are the eyes. She's Yoshevet Petach Einayim. She's sitting in the place of the open eyes. Sitting in a public place, and you would have thought that she was a harlot. She enticed him to come to her, but she asked for several things to establish his identity. And one of the things that she asked for was connected to Ruach HaKodesh, to divine inspiration. She knew that she was going to become the mother of royalty, of the line of David. So she said, give me your chotam. Chotamcha is like their signet ring that a king uses to emboss his official documents. into the melted wax. You can picture that, what that looks like. And so that's the first thing that she asks for, is like, I am going to be the mother of kings. Give me your signet ring. It's also an absolute identifier. It's almost like asking for someone's Tudat Zahut, Lahavdil. But that was the officialdom of the king's ring. And then she asked for Patilha, the Patil or the Patil Techelet. Give me your talis. And this was a symbol of that she would be the forerunner of all of those who sit in the Sanhedrin, because when the Sanhedrin were judging, they wore their talis and tefillin all day long. So this was the second siman that she asked for me, give me your talis. And then the third thing that she asked for is matcha. The mate is the same staff that Moshe used to split the sea, to do the plagues that he was allowed to do. He was not allowed to actually to hit the water because the water saved him. But okay, anyhow, there was another identifying symbol, as that she would be the Choter Migeza Yishai, that there is a pasuk from Yeshayahu that predicted the birth of David coming through the line of Yishai, who was a descendant of Yehuda. Yehuda was the beginner of all of the tribes of the kings. Every king, and including Ad Hayom Hazeh, were waiting for Mashiach to come from the line of Yehuda, from Shevet Yehuda. Now, of the 10 tribes that were exiled during the Babylonian exile, we know about Yehuda and we know about Levi. Those were absolutely identified. The other 10 tribes were scattered. We don't know exactly what happened to them, even though there are different Masorets. Like, for instance, the Ethiopian Jews have a Masoret. They have a tradition that they come from the tribe of Dan, who were great warriors. And you can see what they do in the army is incredible, the Ethiopian Jews. Okay, but she had Ruach HaKodesh. So who else had Ruach HaKodesh like her that caused her to be very proactive? It was even before or at the same time, it's actually in the same parsha Vayeshev, that the wife of Potiphar had unclear prophecy, and she was attempting to allure Yosef into her bedroom because she saw that she was going to have a child with Yosef. Now, she wasn't sure, was it going to be her or her daughter? It turned out her adopted daughter, Osnat, was the one who would bear a child with Yosef in the future. But she had unclear prophecy. Tamar also was motivated by prophecy. She knew she would be a forerunner of kings and of leaders and of the Nasi and of the Mashiach, that the future Mashiach would come from her. So that's what made her go out and sit in Petach Einayim, covering her face, only her eyes were visible. Petach Einayim. Because she could see from one end of the world to the other end of the world. That was the whole point of having prophecy, is that you could see into the future. Now, Tamar's prophecy motivated her to do something that caused her almost to be burnt at the stake, because the punishment, she was a daughter of Shem ben Noach, according to the tradition. And she was of very high elevated lineage herself to start with. But anyone who is a daughter of a Cohen, any woman who's a daughter of a Cohen, and she does some kind of perversion, is liable for the punishment by burning. And so at first, Yehuda said to her, when she claimed, by this man am I pregnant, when everybody was saying she is now pregnant after she was not supposed to be pregnant, she's supposed to be waiting for your third son. Why is she pregnant? And when she went to the court and she was going to be tried as a Bat Kohen, she said, by this man am I pregnant. And she showed the signs, the Chotam, the Patil, and the Mateh. She showed by this man, and she waited. She waited in silence. So that is the image that I'm showing here in this picture, is that David HaMelech actually wrote a special psalm for her, that he praised her silence. And it said, the psalm is Lamnatseach, the Elim Rechokim, Elim Rechokim, Al Yonat Elim Rechokim, the silent dove. Who is the silent dove? The doves, first of all, as the species go, are very faithful to their partner. Once a dove mates with its partner, it never looks anywhere else. And in Shir HaShirim, there are many references, Einayim Kiyonim, your eyes are like doves, that the eyes of the partners are always looking at each other with affection. And so the Elam, not Elam Rechokim was Tamar, that she maintained silence. She didn't say, I am pregnant by Yehuda. She didn't point that finger. She didn't name him. She said, by this person, I am pregnant. And she left it to him to make his choice, if he was going to send her to the fire and save his own reputation, or if he's going to admit his responsibility here and take responsibility for her. And so he does take responsibility. He said, as a matter of fact, he said, Tzadka mimeni. Tzadka mimeni. She is more righteous than I. Now, there you could read this in a different way. You could say Tzadka kama mimeni, and that's the divine voice that's speaking. She is the righteous one, but all of this is from me, from God. That this was all a test, you could say, of these people, of these very righteous and holy people. Would she step up to the plate? Would she have the audacity, the courage to lure her father-in-law? Would she have the courage to go through with it? Would she have the courage to maintain silence and allow him to claim responsibility? All of that took tremendous courage. And this is the lineage of our kings. This is the lineage, the honesty, the subtlety, and the strength of the character, that it becomes the lineage of the kings, of King David and Adi Yom Hazeh, waiting for Mashiach to step up to the plate, so to speak. With that same holy chutzpah.
Which psalm is it?
It's Psalm Nun Vav, 56, and it's a michtam. A michtam, there's a debate about what a michtam is. Michtam, it means, it could be a musical instrument, that it's a type of a very special musical instrument, or it's a very important psalm. So that was the michtam, and it was Lam Natseach, michtam Elem, Yonat Elem Rechokim. And this is referring to Tamar, that she was able to elem, it means silent, quiet, and someone who is mute, who cannot speak for whatever biological or psychological reason, is called an elem. So, no, not elem rechokim.
Okay, so we're going to take the same dynamic, because on one hand, we see Tamar really taking the initiative, being driven by a prophecy. In other words, she had clear prophecy that she needed to give children to this family when her first two husbands died. And she saw that Yehuda was not going to give the third son. So it was like, either I act to fulfill my prophecy, or I don't act. So this, I think a lot of people at different stages in their life, sometimes maybe not as dramatic, to come up with these kind of choices where I know that I should do something. I should make this change in my life. It could be professional, it could be relationships, it could be geographically.
All of us made aliyah.
And some people are able to bring all their forces together and act on what we know is true. And we also know there are many times that we don't. That something tells us this is what we should do, but we just don't have whether it's the intellectual, emotional, psychological strength to do what we really know that we should do. So here we see a classic example of someone who is willing to quite literally put herself on the line for what she believed was true. But at the same time, at the critical moment, it appears she went completely passive. She left the decision for Yehuda to make, and it wasn't really out of being passive. It was out of a deep sense of morality that she needed him to step up to the plate. So we can see the same thing in Ruth as well. In other words, her coming back with Naomi to Beit Lechem was really holy chutzpah. It was unheard of. But it wasn't just, it was more than holy chutzpah. It was what she did was unheard of. And this gets into the whole idea, which we're not going to go into deeply because we just don't have a lot of time, but the whole machloket, the whole disagreement, whether she could convert at all, is because she was a Moabitess, and the Torah clearly says that anyone from Moab cannot convert. And so there had been discussions in legal terms. Did that include the women of Moab? When it says Moab, is it Moab or is it Moab and Moabitess? And it had never been tried until Ruth. And that's the whole scene with Boaz sitting at the gate where he is the head of the Sanhedrin. And according to tradition, right before them, just we'll call it synchronicity. They had just ruled that a Moabitess could convert, but no one had ever done it. Ruth was the first.
She was the test case.
And so later, again, I'm cutting out a lot of the story, but later, this was between the lines of David's whole life, is because at a certain point, the Sanhedrin looked again at this halacha, especially because Boaz and Ruth were married. They were together intimately one night. He dies the next day. And so there were actually almost everyone said, it must be a punishment. Like, why else would this happen? He was with her one night and he dies. It must be a punishment. Maybe we interpreted the law incorrectly. But it went back and forth. And at the time of David, even before he was born, it came up again. And Yishai started having doubts of his own status. And that's why, again, without going into the whole story, David was born in the same kind of way, in a sense, that the daughters of Lot tricked Lot. In other words, he thought he had taken on a concubine because he didn't feel he could be together with his wife anymore. And they did a switcheroo because the wife wanted to give birth to more children. And that is what happened. But when they found out that she was pregnant, it was like, what's going on here? And so basically, David was hidden away. He was considered somewhat of a bastard and illegitimate, and maybe not even Jewish. This is what David contended with his entire life. Now, obviously, he became king of Israel, and the majority of people saw that it wasn't what Yishai thought, that he himself was illegitimate, but it's just, this is the background of all of the struggles of David HaMelech. And so if you don't know this, you can't understand the Psalms. It's only when you understand this ongoing struggle he had, in a sense, to prove his legitimacy, not just even to be king, just his legitimacy to be considered Jewish, was like a cloud over him his entire life. So Ruth converting and coming to Beit Lechem was like, I don't even know if we have words for the courage that it took. But from this comes David and comes Mashiach.
Hashem oz li'amo yiten, Hashem yivarech et amo b'shalom. When we have the oz to defend ourselves, to stand up for ourselves, to do what's right, to follow through on our visions, that's when Hashem protects us with his peace.
Okay, so now I want to try to connect the giving of the Torah and Tamar, because we made a lot of connections with Ruth, and this is a very, very deep idea, but very essential to the story, because the question is asked, and we'll read it right now. After Yehuda understands in this court scene that he was together with Tamar, he didn't know until that point. So it says like this. So it says, Vayaker Yehuda. Yehuda recognized the different things that not here, Vayaker Yehuda. Vayomer Tzadka mimeni. That's when he said, she is more righteous than me. And Rashi, in a classic Rashi, says you can put a hyphen between the two words. Yehuda said, like my wife said, Yehuda said, Tzadka, she's more righteous. A voice came out of heaven and said, this whole thing was mimeni. It's like, this is one of the deepest Rashis, because it looks like, and more than looks like, Yehuda made his choice to be with who he thought was a prostitute. Tamar made her choice of trying to seduce her father-in-law. And God says, mimeni. I was behind this whole thing. Because this is how mysteriously the soul of Mashiach needed to come into the world. But the continuation of the verse says, Ki al kain lo netatiha l'shela. So Yehuda continues to speak. And why is she more righteous to me? Because I had promised to give her my third son, and I didn't. Then it says, V'lo yasaf od ledata. He did not continue to know her intimately. Okay? Now, the Gemara says an amazing thing. The Gemara in Sota, page 10, if anyone wants to look it up. They say, even though it appears that that's the correct translation, that he did not know her more. Lo Yasaf. Yasaf means to add. Yosef. He didn't add in his relationship with Tamar. But the Gemara says, don't read it that way. Read it, he never stopped having relationships with her. And according to tradition, he married her. Now, this is a complicated inyan, because it appears that you can't do such a thing, but you have to understand this is before the Torah is given. And there are explanations that in the laws of the Sheva Mitzvah B'nai Noach, that under certain circumstances, a father-in-law could marry his daughter-in-law. And that's what the Gemara says. The Gemara says he married her. And he continued to have relations with her. But what do they base it on? So the Gemara explains they base it on something happened at the giving of the Torah. So this, if people want to see, this is in Parshat Ve'et Chanan in Devarim. It's chapter 5, verse 19. Okay, so I'm reading this. So it says, this is, now remember, in Parshat Ve'et Chanan, the whole episode of giving the Torah is repeated. It first happens in the book of Shemot in Parshat Yitro, but there's a whole repetition. But we learn there's a lot of repetition in the Torah. But we learn that anytime there's repetition, just look very carefully. There'll always be new aspects that are revealed that were not revealed before. So here's what it says right after the Ten Commandments. It says like this. V'yeta devarim ha'ela diber Hashem el kol kahalchem bahar mitoch ha'esh ha'anan va'arafel. So now Moshe is talking to the people. He's recounting the story to the people and mostly to a new generation. He says all of these things meaning the Ten Commandments, God said to your congregation in the mountain, within the ha'esh, ha'anan va'arafel, within a atmosphere of fire, cloud, and fog. Kol gadol, God's voice was very great. Velo yasaf, exact words as with Yehuda and Tamar. Okay, I'm not going to read continually. So velo yasaf. Again, the pshat is that the giving of the Torah at Har Sinai was a one-time in history event. We're told that it will never be repeated exactly like this. There might be other awesome revelations of God, but exactly like Har Sinai will never happen again. That's the pshat, velo yasaf, this voice, velo yasaf. What does Onkelos say? Onkelos says, velo pasak, it never stopped. This is Onkelos, it never stopped. So how do we understand this? Actually, it's in a Pirkei Avot. It says in Pirkei Avot, every day a voice goes out from Sinai and, in a sense, says, everyone come back. Anyone who's gone astray, come back. I'm waiting for you. Come back to the Torah. So it's a classic question that the Baal Shem Tov asked. He said, if the voice never stopped, how come we don't hear it? Where is that voice? Where is it? So the Baal Shem says, actually, we do hear it. And he said, especially anyone who makes any move in their life to come closer to Torah, come closer to be a mensch, come closer to their own neshama, they're hearing that voice. That is what is motivating them. Very, very similar to the tradition that when a fetus is in the mother's womb, an angel comes and teaches it the whole Torah.
40 weeks of pregnancy.
Right, 40 weeks of pregnancy.
There's the 40 again.
And right before the baby is born, right, the angel touches us here and we forget the whole Torah. The classic question is, if the angel is going to touch us here and we forget the whole Torah, why did he waste 40 weeks teaching us the whole Torah? So the answer is, consciously we forget it. It is engraved in our unconscious. That's why many, many, many people who do tshuva at an early age or even at a later age, a lot of times their reaction is, I know this. This is familiar to me. And I'm sure it's maybe happened to many people here. I remember I was not born in a religious family, far from it. But I'll never forget when I was invited for my first Shabbos meal. I was 23 years old. And it was at Chabad in Berkeley. And I went in to the host's house, and there was just this glow from the candles. There were little kids running around. There was this warmth radiating in the house. And I just said to myself, I know this. I've been looking for this. This is what I've been looking for. So many people have had similar types of that kind of thing. So did you want to say something?
Yeah.
Go on.
So there's several things I want to say
Because
about
we have to,
this word.
we're in the middle of this Inyan.
Hakerna, that the same words that Tamar said to Yehuda in the courtroom, Hakerna, you have to recognize who these things belong to, is the same word that Yehuda used when he brought the Joseph's coat dipped in goat blood to his father Yaakov. And he said, Hakerna, im ketonet bincha im lo. Okay, so there's a verse in Mishlei that says, Chochmat nashim banta beta. A woman's wisdom builds her house. So a woman has to be wise. She has to be clever. So yesterday was my mother's English birthday, May 5th. So Cinco de Mayo. So I want to celebrate and acknowledge my mother. She used to tell me, when your father comes home from work, don't hit him up with a request right away. Let him get in the door, let him sit down, have a nice meal, and then talk to him. Chachmat nashim banta beta. So that was my mother's wisdom. I just want to mention that we're talking about birthdays. Yesterday was my mother's English birthday. Tonight's my Hebrew birthday. And I'm going to be Bezrat Hashem 73. And that's Gematria Chachma. Halavai, I should have some Chachmat Nashim. Halavai, I'm asking God, please bless me and all of us together. When a person has a birthday, they have the power to bless other people too. So I bless all of these lovely women here to have Chachmat Nashim like the way it's supposed to be. Hakerna.
1 second.
Yeah, you usually think of it as Bina, right? You think of woman being the Bina part, but this says Chachma Nashim. So it's like being able to do the switch over and connect the two. Chachma Bina Dat.
We want all of that.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. So Chachma is like the man's wisdom, like the letter Yud. That's the Abba, a little drop of seed. Bina is the hay. It's like the fallopian tube opening up at the top of the hay, and the womb that opens at the bottom, like the letter hay. That's the Ima. Abba, Ima, they're united by Da'at. Da'at is always a euphemism, and we're reading about that here in the story. Below Yasaf Da'ata. He did not continue to know her, intimate knowledge.
Okay, so with the few minutes left, I'm gonna try to finish this Inyan. So we can ask, well, which one is right? Did he continue to know her or did he not? The written Torah in both cases by Har Sinai and here is no. And yet there is another perspective where you could read the same words. Again, it has to do with the text, but you could read the same words as he didn't stop. So obviously there's two traditions here. So in many cases like this, you see it throughout the Talmud. One Chazal will say this, and one will say this, complete contradictory, like day and night. And then the Gemara will say hundreds of times, lo kasha. It's not a disagreement. When the first person was talking about, it was this type of case. And when the second one was talking about, he was talking about this type of case, meaning they were both the same kind of case, but very different circumstances within that context. Hundreds of times in the Gemara. So here also, we could apply the same idea. How? How can you take that he didn't know her again and he did? So the way you could explain it, I'm not saying that this is the only way to explain it, but you could explain it that every action has ramifications. in life in general, in our own lives, things happen. Put it this way, a lot of things in our daily life happen, and at least on the surface, we don't see any effects from them. Our lives are a series of this happens, and then this happens, and then this happens, and this happens. Within 2 days, we forget most of what just happened, and we don't necessarily feel any effects, cause and effect, or mita keneged mita, but we all know there are certain things that happen in our life. Some of them can take 1 second or a minute or 2 minutes that affect the whole rest of our life. Sometimes chas v'sholom, it could be something tragic, and sometimes it could be something wonderful. But things happen and they have an ongoing effect. They have an ongoing effect. So you could say that he really did not be with her again. But she became pregnant. And from her pregnancy comes David HaMelech. In other words, the results, the effect of the action never stopped. It never stopped. So same thing with giving of the Torah in Sinai. In one respect, it was a one-time event. But its energy, its ramifications are unto our day. There's one explanation that's given that, and we know this from today with trauma, that if someone, God forbid, experiences trauma, especially at a young age, it can go with them their whole life. Doesn't mean it will ruin their life, but once something gets deep inside, it is very hard to get out. Very hard to get out. Many Holocaust survivors, as is known, would not talk about it, could not talk about it till sometimes 30, 40, 50 years later. But what was going on in their head, there's certain things that you see and experience. And even after that, you could live a, quote, normal life. And how many Holocaust survivors arrived in wherever it was, in America, Canada, Australia, whatever, with not even the shirt on their back. And they put their lives together, they remarried, they had children, they were part of communities, built businesses. So it doesn't mean it has to ruin your life, but can you imagine someone who went through that on the inside? It's just very hard to deal with that. So the same thing with the giving the Torah and the Sinai, we're told that the event was so powerful that, and they actually know today that certain events can happen that change your DNA. That can actually, it affects every cell in your body to such a degree, it can actually change your DNA makeup. So we're told that that's what happened at Sinai to the Jewish people. That it was such a powerful event. It's like being in the mother's womb. We don't necessarily remember it, but it is engraved in us, this kind of connection with the giver of the Torah, with Hashem. So I'm going to try to tie a few last things together here. And one of the reasons that we read the book of Ruth, I didn't mention, but this is a perfect time, because here we just saw this idea where the Torah seems to be saying something very clear, and the sages come and say it means exactly the opposite. So this is part of the oral tradition. And we're told that one of the reasons that we read the book of Ruth is, and we don't have time now, I'll just mention it so you could all notice. The book of Ruth is 4 chapters. It's a very short book. But in the second half of the book, there is the greatest concentration of what's called a ketiv and kri. That a word will be written in the text in a certain way, but then in like the right-hand column, you'll see a note saying we read it differently. Now this happens in the Chumash also, but the greatest concentration of ketiv and kri in the entire Tanach is in the book of Ruth, and also all in like 1.5 chapters, and most of it, and this will fill out what we were saying before about Tamar, was super active, but she was also, in a certain sense, she took a passive role at the right time. So once Naomi hears that Ruth ended up in the field of Boaz, and she understood that Boaz is one that can redeem their fields and actually can marry Ruth and return them to their previous status. So she instructs Ruth what to do. On both Naomi and Ruth's side, this is totally holy chutzpah. Go down to the threshing floor. Boaz will be there by himself. Go and sit by his feet and basically tell him,
right?
yeah, that's what I'm getting to. Tell him to marry you, right? He didn't propose. She came and said, will you marry me? And so, holy chutzpah here. But if you look at the story, again, you have to look in the right-hand columns, there's a series of instructions where Naomi tells her, get dressed, wash off, go down. It's written as if Naomi is getting dressed and washing and going down herself.
Yeradati,
Right,
rachatzti.
yeah, but you don't read it like that. You read it as if she's giving instructions to Ruth. You do this, you do that, but it's written. But what do we see from this? And then there's also something extremely unusual. In 2 places, there's a word that is written, and we're told don't read it. And there's another word that is not written, and we're told to read it. So these are unusual phenomenon in the Torah. But it all points out one of the reasons that they say that we read the book on Ruth to tell us something very important, that along with the written Torah, there is an oral Torah. And you cannot understand the written Torah without the oral Torah. It sounds to us like obvious, but I've had the privilege to teach like all over the world and to a lot of non-Jews or Jews who don't know any Hebrew. Their only exposure to the Bible is to read it in English with no commentary. And so I always try to point out anyone who reads today's English translation of the King James translation, of the Greek translation, of the original Hebrew, which has no vowels in it and has no oral tradition with it, not only can't you understand the Torah, but in most cases you will get the totally wrong impression. You absolutely cannot understand any of it reading it just in English. So that's one of the things they say about Ruth, is because it has such a dense amount of these special oral traditions that it's mashlim the written Torah. I have a lot of more material here, but I do want to give it a chance for people to ask or comment or share. And maybe I'll add a little bit more, but I want to give everyone a chance. First,
I just wanted to show this picture to anybody who's on the Zoom and wasn't able to see it, of Tamar sitting the Petach Einayim.
Is that what it says?
Yeah.
That she was sitting in the-
yeah.
The eye-opening place.
Now the Gemara actually comments on that. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Some say that the name of the place was Einayim. She was right outside of a city. And so she was sitting at the entrance to the city called Einayim. Others say, like Rachel said, is that she went there with wide open eyes. In other words, she had a plan. She knew exactly what she was going to attempt. So she went with open eyes. And others say that the eyes here represent Avram Avinu, as because the place where she sat was in the area that Avram Avinu used to hang around. And it was Avram Avinu who saved the first hidden mysterious spark of Mashiach by saving Lot, by pleading for Lot, who then gives birth to his daughters to Moab, and from Moab comes Ruth. So they say that the Petach Einayim is that Tamar was, in a sense, in the tradition of Avram Avinu in her prophecy of wanting to bring kings into the world. Yeah.
I have a lot of questions. Okay, it's not going to happen today. But it's so interesting and so deep. Everything, beautiful presentation. Two things. One is I didn't get the technicality of what happened with Ishai. Who was he married to, and who did he marry when he had David? So
Okay.
all the other brothers were children of a different wife?
No, okay. Yeah, go on.
Just the background.
Okay,
question.
so Yishai was married and had a number of children before he had David. Okay, but the problem is that he began questioning, like they re-examined the whole decision about a Moabitess being permitted to convert. So they were re-examining this, and he began to doubt his own lineage. Is he really a kosher Jew because he comes from converts or not? And so he decided to separate from his wife, with whom he had a number of children. And he took a concubine. He was planning to sleep with that concubine that night. His wife heard about it and said no. And she made the concubine go away. She snuck into the concubine's tent and waited for her husband. She conceived that night. His wife conceived that night, even though he thought he was going to somebody else.
Where is this?
It's in
Midrash.
But it's also in Sefer Shmuel. It's in Sefer Shmuel. When Shmuel goes to anoint David, he says, says to Yishai, bring out all your children. They bring out these handsome, strong, tall guys, one after the other. And he said, nope, this isn't it. And then they bring out this scrawny Gingy. And they said, this guy, he's the one who's out over there with the sheep and the goats. That's the one I want.
So
He was rejected by his brothers. They thought his mother slept with somebody else, because Yishai didn't know he slept with his own wife. Yishai thought he was with the concubine. The brothers rejected him. They said they sent him out with the sheep.
No.
Wife did not reveal
No.
that.
His wife was
No.
silent. Again, the silence.
No.
Chochmat nashim banta beitah.
Like as Anisha Sapa, how is it possible that they did not
That's
tell her?
he.
Oh,
Ishai's wife. Well, David's
that's a good
son.
question.
Very
No,
good
that's
question.
a good question.
David's son.
That's a good
Oh,
question.
what's the question?
That's an excellent
wait.
question,
I'm
also.
sorry, I want to hear everybody.
David suffered
Yeah.
because they.
Yes,
thought that he
because
was-
they rejected him. They thought he was an
Yeah.
illegitimate child.
I thought maybe, I had thought that, the background, that they did know he was the son of the wife, of the original wife, but it was after the machlokas came up. So he had a different status. He had he had all these children with his wife when they were holding by that halacha,
Mhm.
that psak that they have been going on for years. But suddenly there was a different psak, and from that point on, so that we have to change things. So
That's why he separated from his wife,
Right.
but she wasn't going to have any of that.
I just want to fill in a little bit that according to tradition, the concubine was actually a Canaanite slave, and who could become Jewish. And he said to her, if we figure this whole mess out, in those days they married more than one wife, you will become my wife. And if not, if I am actually illegitimate, then I'm allowed to be with you, right? And also, according to tradition, the Canaanite slave helped the mother. It wasn't that the mother forced the Canaanite slave out, that she cooperated with her, but she felt bad for her. Your question is an excellent question about why wasn't she brought as a sota? It could be, they did their best to hide this whole thing. And that's why David was quite literally, he was an outcast. He was sent out to the fields. So when Shmuel and Navi came, he went through all of the sons and he said, isn't there anyone else? And Yishai did his best, try to get around it. But he saw that Shmuel wasn't going forward. So he said, there's another youth who's in the fields
But
with.
he didn't think it was his son, so that means all of his life, he shied.
No. He knew it was his son. But because of the dark cloud under which he was born, he was a total outcast from the family. Total outcast. And this, again, it's as God has his ways. There is a tradition that we have this throughout the story of Mashiach. We have Lot and his daughters. We have Yehuda and Tamar. Also Boaz and Ruth. He dies the next day. And she's this unusual person. Is she a convert? Is she not a convert? And then the way David is born. And so it's explained in it's like a mystical understanding is that, that the gematria of Mashiach is the same gematria as Nachash, 358. And this is a big thing in Kabbalah, explaining how can it be that there's a connection between the Nachash and Mashiach. But the idea is that for the Mashiach to accomplish what he has to do, he has to be able to, what's called Kabbalistically, lift up the lowest sparks from the lowest places and redeem them in order to redeem the world. This is this idea, it's in Yeshayahu, and it's in, I believe, the 53rd chapter. For Christians, this is the most important part of scripture, is what's called the suffering servant, where Yeshayahu describes the circumstances of a future redeemer. And it says that he will suffer for our sins. He will be according to the Gemara, he'll be a Mitzorah. He will be an outcast. He will suffer tremendously, and it will be to like fix the world. So Christians picked up on this, and in a sense, they built their figure around this prophecy, not the opposite. They built, because remember, the New Testament wasn't written down to hundreds of years after the figure that we call Yeshu. The earliest one was 100 years, and the other books were written even later. There were no first hand witnesses at that point. And so basically, Greek philosophy and later the Roman Empire, they created Christianity. We know very, very little of the actual story of the founder of Christianity. We know very, very little, very little. I hope that answered it. It's a very complicated issue, but there is to this day this idea that certain tzaddikim take upon themselves certain sa'ar of the community. There is this notion, it all comes back from these ideas from like a long time ago, going back to Yeshayahu. This prophecy of Yeshayahu, but just because the Christians took it doesn't mean he was talking, to us and the world. He wasn't trying to build this figure that they would build, but he was trying to give over this idea. We might think Mashiach will come, he'll be like this, like no worries. He's a perfect being. We're told no, just like now. Someone might say, I wish I was at Tzaddik. I wish I was at Tzaddik. But do we have any idea how much sacrifice tzaddikim take for their communities, for people coming to them day and night with the hardest questions in the world, the most heartbreaking circumstances, and the tzaddik has to handle all of this. So we have this idea that tzaddik, he's beaming light, and it's true. That's what makes him a tzaddik. He can deal with all this and still be full of joy and full of influencing people for the good. But what they go through, you really think about it. I mean, the Lubavitcher Rebbe had what's called yechidus. He met with individuals for like, what? Huh? Okay. For like 25, 30 years, almost the whole night, giving person after person his whole attention, his whole being. Can you imagine the stories that he heard? Can you imagine what he had to take upon himself?
I have a great story about that. I heard this from the person it happened to. That when you go into the Rabbi for Yechidus, you have to give a list of things that you want to ask, and you give it to the Gabbai. The Gabbai reads it and gives it to the Rabbi. So by Lubavitch, maybe by other Rebbes too, but this was for sure by Lubavitch. And so somebody came to the Rebbe, and you get very nervous when you're in the presence of a great person. And so he was very nervous. He reached in his pocket, he gave the list to the Gabbai. The Gabbai gives it to the Rebbe. The Rebbe is like reading it and he's sweating. He's struggling so hard to give an answer. And point by point, he gives an answer to every single question. And the person feels such a relief. Oh, now I have the advice of a tzaddik. And he leaves the room and he reaches into his pocket and he pulls out the list. Wait a minute. This is the list I was supposedly gave to the Rebbe. What did I give the Rebbe? Oh my God, it was my wife's grocery list. I mean, what Ruach HaKodesh, what incredible Ruach HaKodesh that he was able to answer, but he really had to like X-ray vision into that pocket to see what the other list was. This is an incredible story, but it also, under our present circumstances, the whole Am Yisrael, the grief that we've experienced this week because of what happened in Har Miron, it's like our Rabbi Yitzchak Ginsburg's answer was, he quoted from the Torah when Aharon HaKohen lost his two sons at the dedication of the Mishkan. He said, Vayidom Aharon. And we have a Mishlei that says, and Aaron was silent. What can you say? There are just no words. And that's also our minhag when we go in to comfort a mourner. We don't start the conversation. Vayidom Aharon. And we also have a mishlei that says, Shtika yafeh lechochma. So we're talking about chochma. I'm entering my chochma year, halavai. You should know when to be silent.
Okay, I just want to say one other thing is that, first of all, I really want to thank Julie and Yafa, who this whole year have been organizing this.
Thank you.
And we really, really appreciate it. And giving us the recordings, and we put it up on our website. And so many people actually get to see these classes. But just interesting. So I said this would be the last time we're bringing books, but then I realized that we could leave them here. So
Okay.
I will leave them. But I saw a bunch of people were like very, very interested in this whole thing about the oral tradition and the Ketiv and the Kri and reading words that aren't there and all of this. So it just happens that supposedly today, it was supposed to have been already, but supposedly today, my newest book is going to be coming out of the printer, and it's on the subject. It's called 70 Faces. So next time I come, I'll be able to bring it. It's called 70 Faces, and it's a very, very unique book that took many years, and there's actually no way to finish this book. What it is 70 different methodologies developed by the sages over the years as how to reveal deeper meanings in the Torah. And they're all connected to the text. It's all connected to the text. We did a few of them today, the Ketiv and the Kri, but Rachel did the thing with, do you recognize?
Akerna.
So this is called Mida Keneged Mida, a measure for a measure, because the same words are used, and because it's a cross-reference, a measure for a measure. Because Yehuda said to his father, and he tricked him, do you recognize the cloak of your son? So
Tamar.
when it came to his turn, it was
He tricked him
Haker.
back.
Do you recognize?
Use the same word.
Right. And the big letters in the Torah, the small letters in the Torah, the dots on the Torah, extra letters in the Torah, missing letters in the Torah, words that are repeated, a whole slew of different types of gematria, masculine words that are written in the feminine words that are written in the masculine, singular words that are written in the plural words that are written in the singular, and there's 70 of them. There's 70 different methodologies, and each one has 8 to 15 examples and explained. So it's a huge book. But I'm just letting you know, it's like a reference book. It's a book you read for your whole life, because you don't read it from cover to cover. It's like,
When you come across it, then
yeah.
So you appear in the other places as well, that root of you recognize it. Because it seems to me I've seen.
Off the top of my head, I don't know. Top of my head. Now, I have to say, the person that we quote the most is the Bala Turim. If you're familiar with the Perush of the Bala Turim, it's a short Perush, but it is, and he uses all of these different methodologies to explain what's happening below the surface. And one of the things he does, he will take Vayakerna, and he'll bring every place in the Tanach where it is, and then he'll make a connection. Why do they appear in all these different places?
Is it true that the Bala Turim wrote all of his parish in one night? Is that him?
Huh. Interesting.
I heard this recently from somebody in my home. I don't remember if it was Bala
It vaguely sounds familiar. I don't know if it's true. I wouldn't doubt it. I have heard that Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan at one time put out a whole list not a whole list, a whole series of smallish books, like 80 pages, 90 pages, but totally all the sources brought. And I heard that some of them he wrote in 1 or 2 days, including the sources. Yeah, including the sources. And many people said that he kind of worked himself into a grave, that he would stay up for just days at a time writing. Yeah, what he produced in 10, yeah, all of his books were in 10 years. And I mean, even the Mamlo Ez is a set this big. He translated the whole No? Oh, okay. But it's still this big on a shelf.
But he was a
Yeah.
physicist, he was a wrestler, he knew many languages, he was an artist, he was a
Scientist.
He was a scientist, he knew everything about plants. He was 48 when he passed away. And he did the most deepest book, Sacred and Secret, translating Sacred
Yes.
by ear, translating.
Yes, I have them all.
I have everything.
No.
Did you know Avram Sutton back then?
I know he was friendly with the black, but she was
Yeah,
clear-
okay.
I know it. But I was intimately, before he died, 2 days before, I was on the phone with him for about two hours. And he told me a lot of secrets at that time, before he passed. He was revealed too much was revealed to him. It's like
Yeah.
too much revelation.
Yeah.
It's like
He knew everything.
Yeah.
How can you have vessels for so much?
Yeah.
He knew everything. It's amazing. What a Renaissance man.
He was the Renaissance.
Okay, thank you all for coming. Thank you all
Okay,
for
so
coming.
call you again later.
Thank you.